Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We are going to talk about envy today,
Spiritual envy,
and how it gets in the way of having authentic connection. So this is something that Persia and I have experienced a lot of, and everyone I think does. So it's something that we all on the spiritual journey kind of have to come to grips with. We have to be able to understand why it's happening and how to work with it. Persia has a lot of good points.
I like to be prepared.
Yeah.
Well, so what is spiritual envy? This is resentment of another person's spiritual gifts, and that's a mistaken belief from the start. Resentment of a person's community recognition for those gifts, or resentment of a person's wisdom. It's an insidious form of envy. It isn't just in the Western culture, which is a very comparison and competitive culture. It exists in the ancient traditions everywhere on the globe. It's more insidious in Western cultures.
Yeah, we are from birth, and our training and our schooling are taught to be competitive about everything for self-worth, and being competitive and comparing yourself to others. If we think about Don Miguel, that's one of the 4 agreements. Don't compare yourself to other people. It's a very essential element of being on the spiritual path. So we have to recognize it in ourselves and see if someone's doing it and know how to deal with it. So there's many ancient stories. I'll even talk about Milarepa, who's a very famous Tibetan yogi, the most famous. He had a lama that got competitive and envious of him, and that's why he got poisoned. So it's something that happens in every culture. It's just in our culture, it's like it's hyperactive envy. So that's something we really have to be paying attention to.
You can't walk the spiritual path without having to come into contact with this on a very, very regular basis. That's why you have to do so many initiations to stop being entangled with what other people think of you. But in terms of what spiritual envy is, this is an act of aggression that's part of the trauma response called fight, in fight or flight or freeze. What happens is that a very destructive pattern gets set in the neural pathways of the brain when we feel, as children, cut off from love, and we stop seeing the core of love within us because we close ourselves to be able to stop the overwhelm of a traumatic event. And when we close ourselves and go into a reaction, this can start developing into a personality. So it's important to understand this is an act of aggression. It's often overlooked and tolerated because it's so insidious and not identified as an act of aggression. This is the fight response. This is coming from a lack of self-worth that happens the minute we have to close our hearts to numb the overwhelm of pain. When we close our hearts, we have to consciously reopen it, and that's an intense initiation to do that. So some signs and key points about spiritual envy is that there are people in your life who are going to get into a constant, very manipulative power struggle with you, where they will try to tug you into what's called a king of the hill power struggle. And if they can get a reaction out of you on their unconscious level, it makes them feel like, I don't have to grow because I got a reaction out of that
I
person.
just proved that you're not as spiritual as you're saying you're being, or you're not as healed as you're saying that you are, because I got you to react and respond to this jealousy thing that I'm doing.
Right, so that's what's called gaslighting. When somebody is in a power struggle to be the king of the hill, they will intentionally try to emotionally throw you off by lying to you and making false claims about you in order to devalue your worth. Another key point about spiritual envy is that it's a false belief that God has blessed one person and abandoned the other. First of all, there are no spiritual gifts. God doesn't bless one being and abandon another. There's no such thing as a spiritual gift. There are only choices. choices that you make to go through initiations, and the purpose of initiation is to demolish false self-perception. The more you do that, the more the light can fill you, and that person will gain spiritual gifts because they made a very difficult, rigorous choice to empty themselves of old habits. That is the only way initiation happens, or someone has such pure sincerity and bliss for God that can also override all the need to go through that. But that's because the person's soul is so pure, and most likely it's not just because they're special and chosen by God in this lifetime, it's because they did the work in a previous incarnation. So there's no such thing as a spiritual gift. It is a false perception that God chooses some over another. This spiritual success of another does not diminish your own self-worth. It's impossible for anything to diminish your self-worth because it's inherent to your existence, because you are born of divine love. The only thing that can corrupt that is your own false perception of your self-worth, which comes from the trauma we discussed.
And when I started practicing the 4 agreements, as Don Miguel says, and he talks about not comparing yourself to anybody, then when you make that agreement, you free yourself from having envy or competitiveness. And when you hear a spiritual story, you recognize that that spiritual story, what this person is talking about or writing about, any spiritual story that comes to you, it's about you. It's about your true nature. It's about something that you can access for yourself. So if someone, and we've talked about doing mantras and having like the Buddha show up and help us, if we are talking about that, it's because we are saying you can do the mantra and you can have the Buddha show up and help you. We're not special. We're talking about we did this work, and so this is what the response was.
The spiritual reality is real, and when we're sharing our personal experience, we're not comfortable sharing our personal experience. We either trust someone or we think it will be of benefit. And both times, it's always because we think it will be of benefit. We're sharing it so that the other person is inspired by the truth of the spiritual path.
So when I first made the agreement with myself not to compare myself to anybody or be envious of anything, I freed myself to hear any story that came to me through all the different traditions I study and all the teachers I was watching. Any story that came to me, I said, how do I do that? How do I implement what they're saying? How do I absorb what they're saying so that I can progress on my spiritual path? Because we're all just making choices. No one is special in the sense that some people are gifted and some people are not. We all are spiritually gifted, and it's just a matter of how do you integrate and make the choices and do the hard work to allow those experiences to happen for you.
That level of what Grace is talking about is called spiritual sincerity. He instantly heard those stories and knew that's the path for all of us. I'm responsible for myself. So spiritual envy is an excuse that you're not responsible for yourself and that you don't see your inherent self-worth. You don't have sincerity yet because you're still blocked by that space where you closed your heart. So another key point about spiritual envy that needs to be discussed is that it's disguised as righteousness. It can be masked easily because, yes, there are many people in any tradition on the planet, but very strongly now, today, in the present time in the West, yes, it's true. There's a lot of people who don't even know what initiation is, and they are very curious and interested and maybe new in opening the door, or maybe trained by somebody who didn't have integrity in terms of sanctioning the work, and they're trying to create a image. They might have some level of a good intention, but there is a lot of that going on, and it's a very natural part of the journey. But it can get heavy-handed sometimes when people are marketing and advertising all the time and saying, I'm teaching a master level class. The bottom line is that in sanctioned cultures that have intact lineages, with elders who are fully awakened and recognized as fully awakened, if you, like, for instance, if you're in Peru, they have a level of initiation called Alto Messiah, or an even higher level. These are aspects of light initiation. The Karakiak. And if you go around calling yourself that by self-defined perimeters rather than proof, people will look at you and say, go ahead and prove it. They know the precise spiritual capabilities associated with each of those levels. So to some degree, you don't have to hide, if you want to be of service 100%, some of the abilities you have. You have to occasionally talk about it. And I've made the mistake of being so concerned in the past of offending people that I have hundreds of people in my community that I originally studied when I was learning all these initiations. I hid everything. Most of my community has no idea what I do. I only shared it with people I really loved and trusted, and that usually turned out to be a mistake because people were carrying spiritual envy. And I have a lot of stories. I might tell one today of what that looks like. But
I'll just add that when you start to identify these things in your community or friends, it triggers a lot of grief. Because you realize the people around me are not who I thought they were.
Yeah.
And they're not the supportive, loving people I thought they were. Because when you start to realize that if you share your spiritual healing journey, you share your successes, you share maybe new doors that have opened up for you, and people are trying to tear you down instead of celebrating your ability to heal something, you're with the wrong people, and that is sometimes
that's not a true friend.
Not easy to deal with, and it brings up a lot of grief.
You can love those people, but if you have self-worth, you're not going to keep letting those people into your inner circle.
I like to say, if someone tries to hand you a turd and you don't take the turd, whose turd is it? It's not yours, so don't take people's stuff on.
Yeah, love and accept where somebody's at and move on. That's not easy to do because it's hard to see these things in each other. But also, just because somebody talks openly, even on a very restrained basis, about some spiritual aspect of their development, it doesn't mean that they think they're superior or that they're coming from a place of ego. It means that they have often, and it can mean that, but that's on you. If you're wrong about it, you have to deal with yourself. That's the only important part, is your self-responsibility. But if somebody has an immense amount of passion for the path and they're sharing it with a close loved one they consider a friend, and that loved one gets triggered, that's on them. It is not a sign because you shared something that you are spiritually arrogant or believe you're superior. In fact, you may be sharing it because you believe this belongs to all of us, and you're enthusiastic about the fact that these truths exist, and you're immensely loving of those truths, and you want to share them for all of those who are receptive. If somebody lashes out in a king of the hill or comparison, they're not receptive, and you just have to accept that and honor that. I will share a story briefly of when I was being recognized for the first time, I think in my very early 30s. This was a long time ago. And I was asked to teach at some very prominent colleges to do an experimental workshop and be a guest speaker, leading, a workshop about shamanism. And it went really well, and it was incredibly loving and beautiful and inspiring. And when I went to a dinner gathering with some colleagues at their house who had studied this path with me, the air was so thick you could cut it with the amount of spiritual envy that was going on. And I felt that coming before I attended, so I decided I didn't really feel comfortable sharing it with people, even though people knew that I had just taught this. At the end of the evening, somebody, asked, how did it go, in front of everyone? And I just very, very quietly and humbly said, I was really nervous and scared about it, because I was having some anxiety about presenting, and it actually went really well. I didn't share my spiritual gifts with anyone. I just talked about principles. I didn't tell them anything about myself personally. I've only started doing that recently. And that was the end of the conversation. And when the majority of people went home, the host of the evening started telling me that I was ambitious and that I didn't deserve what had been offered to me as being a teacher, that I was too young to be doing something like this, and for 45 minutes tried to shove that down my throat. And I love that person so much, and I will always love that person, but it changed my relationship with them forever. It was very transparent what was happening, and it was a wake-up call that I was not honoring myself, but from being tolerant of that type of behavior. And I held on to that friendship for a few years, and a number of events happened that made it worse. And I confronted each time and said, that's not my truth. I don't honor what you're saying. And they continued to be very forceful. And every time something like this came up. And I said, I don't agree with that. And then I just decided to walk away and honor that this person was not willing to do their work. Because I want to love myself enough to have friendships where people don't attack me because I have opportunities. They celebrate me. That's self-love, and that's spiritual maturity from doing your own personal work. And that's not easy work. That takes a lot of courage, and it's painful. So the antidote to spiritual envy, on both sides, people have to be honest about what's going on. If someone's not receptive to being honest on one side or the other, that's on them. That's the hard truth. But for the person who's carrying spiritual envy, we teach a method to all of our clients about two scientific methods, one for rewiring your own brain and one for taking refuge in the divine by surrendering what it is that you see inside of yourself. If you recognize that this is coming from that state of closing your heart during trauma or shame that was insidious in your childhood, and that you know you developed this bad habit that's now infused in your personality as a trauma coping mechanism, you know it's destructive to yourself and to your relations with others. It's unkind. And it creates mistrust of you because you're showing you're not trustworthy. So it has to be dealt with. It's not easy to deal with. But step number one is to say, I recognize this is happening in me, and it's coming from the fact that when I closed my heart from overwhelm of suffering or overwhelm of being shamed as a child, I closed my heart to recognizing my own nature as divine love, and I need to get back to that, and I need to ask for help, and I need to be honest that this is what's going on. If you're not willing to do that, you can't heal it. You have to look at it objectively as the witness and kind of take a step back and look at it as a universal energy that doesn't mean you're unworthy of love. It just means that there's a healing that needs to be taken accountability for. And to do that, you have to ask for help from the divine that lives within you.
So I think that's our small talk today, and we'll post this and look forward to your comments, and like the video, share with friends and family. There's lots of good stuff. We're going to keep adding more videos all the time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.